Hello and welcome to Access Asia. I'm Yuka Huayi. Coming up in this show, China rolls back its zero COVID policy, but at what cost? We'll take a deep dive into President Xi Jinping's pandemic response and how Beijing is preparing to move forward. Protests rock Mongolia. Public anger over hundreds of thousands of tons of missing coal has sparked a broader anti-government movement. And is Indonesia's songbird craze still fueling illegal trade? Our correspondents went to find out. China has relaxed many of its pandemic restrictions, removing requirements for PCR tests in many places and allowing people to isolate at home. The new measures come following a wave of anti-lockdown protests. Joining me now is France 24's former Hong Kong correspondent Oliver Farry. Hi, Oliver.
Hello.
So could this mark an end to China's draconian zero-COVID policy?
Well, it's probably a little too soon to say, but there's certainly a step in that direction. China's Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism this week announced what it called 10 new optimization measures, which do pave the way for a relaxation. There's no explicit mention of a dynamic zero COVID, as the Chinese government calls it, but there's no explicit end to it, but there's no mention of it either. The messaging is quite different now. The health authorities are saying that Omicron is nothing to fear, as Li Guangqi, the director of the aforementioned State Council Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism, said to the state broadcaster CGTN. Also, the most respected of China's virologist Zhang Nanshan also said that Omicron was less scary than other variants. Now, this is very much a volte-face, a complete 180 turn from what the Chinese government had previously been messaging. A number of these new measures, as you mentioned, there's no need for mild cases to quarantine in centralised locations now. They can do that at home. That has not been the case for the past 3 years. There's also no longer a need to have a positive PCR test to use public transport or in public buildings. Lockdowns have been suspended in most places, but that does not necessarily mean they're gone forever. There are also some exceptions. For instance, institutions like schools can still demand positive PCR tests if they wish. And of course, the reality is also complicated. There is a lag between the official message getting out and the reality on the ground.
So it appears then that the recent protests did have some impact on the decision-making.
Well, they certainly gave the Chinese government pause for thought, even if there were already some moves towards a relaxation earlier in February. The protests had a number of routes. One of them was an infamous fire in a lockdown building in Urumqi in Xinjiang, in which 10 people died. And there was also the widespread anger and discontent as a result of televised images of the World Cup from Qatar, where the sight of maskless fans enjoying themselves from all countries hit home with Chinese people. It wasn't as if they were unaware of things being like that in the outside world, but there certainly was a confluence at that particular time. And this was to the extent that Chinese state TV started censoring close-ups of fans in the stands. Now, the protests were unlikely to immediately challenge Chinese government rule, but they probably did also think that allowing it to snowball into something else could actually be quite critical and probably would have been potentially more perilous than having a wide-scale COVID outbreak after living with the virus.
And how has the public reacted to the announcement of the easing of COVID measures?
Well, the emotions are decidedly mixed. Many people, particularly in cities like Shanghai, which underwent fairly punishing lockdowns, there was rejoicing. There's also an outpouring of support for the late ophthalmologist Li Wenliang. He was the whistleblower who early on during the pandemic in Wuhan, raised the alarm about a mystery virus in the city in late 2019, only to be reprimanded for spreading rumours. And he later died of COVID at the height of Wuhan's outbreak. He has since been rehabilitated and hailed as a martyr by the Chinese government. But an awful lot of Chinese people aren't really buying that. There are also people who might be immunocompromised who are worried about the impact of an outbreak on the on themselves. The hashtag #WhatIfITestPositive on the social media platform Weibo has been trended, and it's relayed many testimonies from worried people, particularly at a time when the messaging may not always be coherent, the messaging from the government, that is. And we have here now a few reactions from people on the streets in China to the relaxation of the measures.
I'm very happy. The policy came a little late, but it's better than nothing.
Life and work have become easier now because we don't need negative COVID-19 tests to enter office buildings, which means we can now reduce the number of COVID-19 tests we take, and it in turn saves our time.
So is China sort of catching up with many other countries in the world that have done away with COVID curves and have been living with the virus for the past 2 years? And how will the new policy play out in China, given that a lot of elderly people have yet to be vaccinated there?
Well, China is not exactly letting COVID rip, and there is bound to be a rise in cases, which is to be expected in a country that hasn't really any built-up immunity from previous infections. Western countries, which were devastated early on in the pandemic on a scale that wasn't really seen in China, are probably not the best comparison, but rather other East Asian countries might be a better measure, such as Vietnam, which eased restrictions a year ago and did rather well. It managed to keep death rates relatively low because of a very successful vaccination campaign. But there's also Hong Kong, which dragged its heels on vaccinating the elderly in 2021. And when it was hit by Omicron last year, its very, very strict arrival quarantine policies were breached as a result of that. It suffered the highest death rate in the world post-vaccination. So that is quite possibly something that might happen in China. Vaccination rates among the over 80s are still very, very low, and only about 40% of the population as a whole have vaccination boosters. A study commissioned by the science journal Nature estimated that between 1 and 2 million people could die if there was a large-scale outbreak. Now, it probably will be a lot less than that, but it's also possible that the death rates might be underreported, because the Chinese government will be trying its best not to squander the political capital that it built over keeping China largely free from COVID over the last 2.5 years.
So we'll have to wait and see how it plays out in China. Well, Oliver Farry, thanks so much for your insight. In Mongolia's capital, Ulaanbaatar, students and other protesters have been demonstrating outside the parliament for days, accusing the government of corruption. The recent discovery that hundreds of thousands of tons of coal went missing between 2013 and 2019 fueled rising public discontent over inflation and inequality. Michael Maitland-Jones has more.
Anger against corruption in Mongolia's government still burning strong. People have been braving sub-zero temperatures in the capital for days now to protest after a scandal in their coal sector. Arrests have been made, including the former CEO of one of the country's largest coal mining firms, but many hold their elected officials responsible.
Members of Parliament need to take accountability. The most important thing we need to do now is to dissolve the government. But the most troubling issue is that uneducated people have ascended to the highest office in Mongolia. So say that government is dissolved, what are we going to put in their place?
Fueling much of the frustration is Mongolia's economic situation. Inflation has soared to over 15%. The country's main sector of mining, which makes up nearly a quarter of GDP, is also under strain.
Mongolia is a mess. There is no accountability. They are digging everything. There's no rehabilitation. In mining, foreign miners get $10,000, while Mongolian miners get 10 times less than that. But the minerals that come from our ground are sold by international pricing standards.
The protests were sparked after 385,000 tons of coal were allegedly stolen from a stockpile in the Tavan-Tolgoi regions on the border with China. The commodity is a giant foreign export for Mongolia. Discoveries of large reserves of this, along with gold in the early 2000s, were a big driver of early economic growth. The pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have both caused major setbacks. Now the country, which previously thrived after transitioning away from a Soviet-dominated economy, is facing a tough combination of both financial woes and dissatisfaction with the people in charge of it.
Now, bird calls and songs are fascinating to many, and in Indonesia, they're big business. The nation's love for bird singing contests drives a multi-million euro industry, from breeding to sales to coaching. Activists, however, are warning that the sport is also fueling illegal wildlife trade. Our correspondents went to Surabaya in East Java to find out more.
These caged creatures are the artists at this competition. The birds sing for 7 minutes while judges rate their performances. They chirp and they croon, and the result is not unlike something you might hear in a forest. Coaches have to stand at a distance, each with his own little cheering technique. The sport was made popular in the 17th century by the royals of Java, and it still has a huge following. The songbird industry, though, has few women. Devi is an exception and travels with her team around the island every week to participate in contests.
I'm nervous. Even the wind makes a difference in these competitions.
Winners are identifiable thanks to a red flag. First prize is a motorbike, second prize is 2,000 euros. Birds are common pets in Indonesia. 1 in 3 homes has one. That's more than 80 million feathered friends living in cages. Here's the champion of the day. It's Devi's bird. The warbler has been in her team for 2 years.
This is his shower. He fought well, so we are cooling him down.
We really take care of him. We pay attention to all of his needs, so he doesn't lack anything. We see that he eats well, and if he needs, we give him extra food.
Poaching wild birds is illegal in Indonesia. Officially, competition birds are bred in captivity. In reality, their origin is difficult to prove. Birds represent 97% of the trafficked animals that Indonesian police save.
Birds don't need to be fed. They need freedom to fly freely. They can find food themselves. When they are a part of nature, they contribute to the ecosystem. They fulfill their true biological function.
Indonesia boasts a rich diversity of bird species, but it's increasingly difficult to find them in the wild.
And that's it for this week's edition of Access Asia. Do stay tuned to France 24. There's more world news coming up.